Hello, and welcome to the presentation on ethical egoism. As always, you should have read the material before viewing this presentation. That said, let's get started. The tenets of ethical egoism are so often confused with that of another theory, psychological egoism, that it's useful to introduce both theories together so that the distinction can be made clear. Ethical egoism is the moral theory that one should always act in one's own rational self-interest, while psychological egoism is the psychological theory that people, as a matter of fact, do always act in their own self-interest, or at least their perceived self-interests. These two theories can be contrasted with ethical altruism, moral theories which hold that at least sometimes people are morally required to sacrifice some of their own self-interest for the sake of others, and psychological altruism, the psychological theory that people can, as a matter of psychological fact, sometimes be motivated to act for the interest of others. Notice what the major distinction between ethical and psychological egoism is. Ethical egoism is a theory about what we morally should do. It prescribes a particular type of behavior and motivational structure in order to be moral. Psychological egoism, on the other hand, is descriptive. It claims to describe how people's motivations actually work psychologically by claiming that they do in fact always act in their own self-interests. Ethical egoists are seldom psychological egoists because it makes little sense to say that people should act self-interestedly if people, as a matter of psychological necessity, always do act self-interestedly. Even though it is a psychological hypothesis, moral philosophers have been concerned with psychological egoism because, if the theory is true, it would be problematic for any ethical theory that prescribes altruistic behavior. This, it should be noted, would include almost all ethical theories except ethical egoism. Ethical egoism, though not a popular philosophy among philosophers, has been endorsed by some philosophers such as Ayn Rand. Though not widely held, the theory remains important as a challenge that all altruistic theories have to face. As with most all of the ethical theories we will be looking at, it is useful to break down the theory of ethical egoism into its component parts. The good under ethical egoism is one's own rational self-interests. The justification for this will be forthcoming in this lecture. The method is to determine what is really in one's own self-interest and then to follow that course of action. And the justification for that is fairly self-explanatory. According to ethical egoism, the ultimate good for each individual is that individual's own rational self-interest. The justifications for this are to be found in the arguments in favor of ethical egoism that we'll be covering later in this lecture. Once we know what the good is under the theory, the method is fairly self-explanatory. In order to act in one's own rational self-interest, one needs to determine what those interests are and then act as to achieve them. Of course, to do this, we need to understand what is meant by rational self-interest a little more fully. Before moving on to the arguments that are often given in favor of ethical egoism, it will be useful to pause and reflect on exactly what the theory prescribes. Ethical egoism does say that one should always act in one's own rational self-interests. Therefore, it is actually morally wrong under the theory to act for the sake of others. In other words, ethical egoism doesn't just give permission to act selfishly or in one's own self-interest, it morally requires that one do so. Anything less is a moral error under the theory. But ethical egoism does not say that one should always do what one wants to do. According to ethical egoism, in order to act morally, a person must do what is really in her or his own best rational self-interest. For example, a person addicted to nicotine might want a cigarette. Nevertheless, if smoking is not in one's own rational self-interest, then according to ethical egoism, one should cease smoking. Likewise, ethical egoism does not just concern itself with short-term interests. One might want to spend most of his or her money as soon as he or she gets his paycheck, but ethical egoism would not endorse this behavior if it would be better or better serve one's interests to use that money to prepare for the future. Also, and this is very important, ethical egoism does not forbid helping others so long as one is helping others out of one's own rational self-interest and not doing so altruistically, that is to say, for the sake of others. For example, giving the police a tip on a suspicious person in the neighborhood might benefit both myself and my neighbors, since it makes it less likely that a crime will take place in a large area. Another example. Suppose a neighbor comes over to an ethical egoist's house and wants to borrow a hammer or a cup of sugar. The ethical egoist is allowed to help out her neighbor if the reason she is doing so is because she expects that the neighbor will likely do her a favor in return one day. Ethical egoists can work cooperatively with others, but to be moral they must be doing so for their own sake, not for the sake of others. Rachel discusses three major arguments for ethical egoism. First, the argument that altruism is self-defeating. Second, the argument that only ethical egoism takes the importance of the individual seriously. Third, the argument that ethical egoism is the explanation and justification for so-called common sense ethics. We will look at each of these in turn. Probably the most common argument given in favor of ethical egoism is that its alternative, ethical altruism, is self-defeating. The argument makes three major claims. First, each person is best able to look after her own self-interests. Second, altruistic help invades the privacy of others. And third, altruistic help is insulting or degrading to others. The first point is that each person can best look after her own self-interest because each person knows her own interest the best. If I have $5 and go out and spend it, I'm likely to buy just what I want or what I feel I most need with that $5. If, however, I instead give that $5 to somebody else and told that person to buy what he or she feels I most want or need, I am likely to get something else entirely. Ethical egoists take this basic idea and argue that we are therefore each better off minding our own business and caring for our own interest exclusively rather than trying to do so for others. If you ever participated in a Secret Santa gift giving at Christmas, you can see this idea at work. How often does one Secret Santa buy him or her exactly what one really wanted, and what one would have spent the same amount of money on herself? The argument is that if we behave altruistically, we are essentially always giving out unwanted, or at least less wanted, Christmas gifts. The second and third points are more straightforward. Ethical egoists making this argument point out that people might find other people trying to help them to be intrusive, demeaning, or degrading, and that therefore people are better off if we mind our own interests and do not try to interfere by helping them. Rachel points out two major objections to this argument. The first is that we often do know what other people want quite well, and, what is more, people are able to make their wants known. While a person spending $5 on a luxury item for me is unlikely to spend it exactly as I would, it's a pretty good bet that a starving person would spend her or his money on food. Likewise, it is a good bet that a person without warm clothing in the winter or shelter to sleep under would desire those things. As for being degrading or invasive, many people do not feel this way, and indeed actively seek help when desperate. Further, even if a person does find being given a handout degrading, that person might prefer this minor degradation or embarrassment over starvation. The second counterargument is even more serious because it undermines the logic of the original argument itself. If you recall, the original argument the ethical egoist makes is that people would be better off if they look after their own interests, and they are likely to be happier if their privacy is not intruded upon and they do not receive the degradation of altruistic help. But now recall what ethical egoism requires of us. It says that we should always act out of our own self-interest and that it is morally wrong to act out of an interest for others. Yet the entire argument that altruism is self-defeating depends on our acting like ethical egoists out of an interest for others. The ethical egoist argues that we should be ethical egoists because other people would be better off. But if we behave like ethical egoists for this reason, we really wouldn't be ethical egoists at all. At best, this is an argument that we should behave like ethical egoists out of altruistic caring. Another argument given in favor of ethical egoism, made popular by Ayn Rand, is the argument that only ethical egoism takes the reality and the importance of the individual seriously. The argument goes like this. Each individual has only one life to live. Therefore, that life is of supreme importance to each individual. Ethical egoism says that each person should use her life for her own benefit. Altruism, on the other hand, says that each individual's life is something that can be sacrificed for the sake of others. Therefore, it doesn't allow each individual to treat her own life as of supreme importance or take the reality of the individual seriously. Rachel's counterargument to this argument is to claim that the ethical egoist commits two fallacies, that of giving a false dilemma and that of attacking a straw man. Rachel points out that Rand formulates the issue as if we had only two options. We can either, possibility 1, be entirely egoistic, which she endorses, or possibility 2, be entirely altruistic. But being entirely altruistic, according to Rand, would mean that we are all being willing to sacrifice our own lives. This makes the theory unacceptable, and so she argues that we should be ethical egoists. Rachel's counterargument is that we have another option. We can be altruistic sometimes. We do not have to live entirely for other people in order to recognize that sometimes the morally right thing to do is to sacrifice some of our own self-interest for the sake of others. Further, in attacking altruistic theories as if they are endorsing being entirely altruistic, Rachel thinks that Rand is attacking a straw man, since no major altruistic theory of ethics endorses pure altruism. Instead, altruistic theories claim that sometimes we should morally act out of an interest for others. The third argument often given in favor of ethical egoism is the claim that ethical egoism can be used to explain our moral behavior. Think about the kinds of ethical rules we believe we should follow. Don't steal from others. Don't physically harm others. And don't lie to others. And so forth. This argument points out that ethical egoism also endorses these values. We should not steal from others because if we do, we will likely be punished, and also others will not respect our property. We should not physically harm others because it is a good way to get physically harmed ourselves, and others will use force against us. We should not lie because then people would not trust us, which would make it hard to benefit by cooperating with others, and in addition, others might not be honest with us. In other words, ethical egoism gives selfish explanations for these prototypical moral behaviors. Rachel's primary criticism against this argument is that while ethical egoism might provide us with motivation to be moral when we know that there will be repercussions for immoral actions, it does not give us a reason to follow such common sense rules of morality when we believe that we can get away with doing otherwise, or when the risk is worth the reward. But common sense morality generally tells us that it would be wrong to steal not just if we might get caught, but also if we can get away with it. Therefore, Rachel does not think that ethical egoism can accurately explore, explain, or motivate common sense moral rules. In Chapter 5 of the Elements of Moral Philosophy, Rachel also discusses three arguments that are commonly given against ethical egoism. These three arguments bear mentioning here and are as follows. First, the argument that ethical egoism endorses wickedness. Second, the argument that ethical egoism is logically inconsistent. And third, the argument that ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary. Of these, Rachel only thinks that the third is especially strong. The argument that ethical egoism endorses wickedness. This argument against ethical egoism is very similar to the counter-argument used against the argument that ethical egoism can be used to explain common sense morality. In that case, we noted that ethical egoism does not give us a reason to not violate common sense ethical principles when we feel certain that we can get away with it or when the risks outweigh the rewards. This criticism of ethical egoism takes this reasoning one step further and points out that not only does ethical egoism fail to give us a reason to obey common sense morality when we can get away with doing otherwise, it actually demands that we violate common sense morality. After all, ethical egoism says that we should always act in our own rational self-interests. If we do not do so, according to the theory, we are acting immorally. So, while it's true that if we think that we would get caught doing something like, say, embezzling money from a charity for orphans, we should not do so out of our own self-interest, it is also true that, under the theory, if we can get away with it, we should embezzle money from the charity. Thus, it is claimed that ethical egoism cannot be an adequate ethical theory because it can endorse such behaviors. The weakness Rachel finds in this argument is that it might beg the question regarding morality by assuming that it is wicked to do things such as embezzle for one's own interests. This argument against ethical egoism claims that ethical egoism fails as a theory because it embodies a logical contradiction if we try to follow it. This is because it can endorse two contradictory courses of action for two different people. Thus, under ethical egoism, if you can get away with it, it is in your own rational self-interest to steal from me, and ethical egoism says you should do so. Likewise, under ethical egoism, it is in my own rational self-interest to avoid being the victim of theft, and so it is my ethical duty to prevent you from stealing from me. But now my ethical duty is to prevent you from doing your ethical duty. If preventing somebody from doing their ethical duty is wrong, then ethical egoism faces a contradiction here. As Rachel points out, however, this argument contains the hidden supposition that preventing one from doing one's ethical duty is wrong, which ethical egoism might not endorse. He therefore does not find this to be a strong argument against egoism. The argument that ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary. Of the three arguments considered against ethical egoism, Rachel finds this to be the strongest. If we recall, Rachel's minimum conception of moral theory requires that the moral theory, first, be an effort to conduct one's behavior according to reason, and second, that it be impartial. According to this argument, ethical egoism fails on the second count because it requires that each person be partial to his or her own self-interests. Rachel puts it this way: ethical egoism advocates that each of us should divide the world into two categories of people, ourselves and everybody else, and that we regard the interest of those in the first group as more important than those in the second. But each of us can ask, what is the difference between me and everyone else that justifies placing myself in this special category? Failing an answer, it turns out that ethical egoism is an arbitrary doctrine in the same way that racism is arbitrary. A quick recap. Ethical egoism is an ethical doctrine that requires that one always act in one's own rational self-interest. It can be contrasted with psychological egoism, which claims that people as a matter of brute fact do always act out of their own self-interest. Under the theory, one must really act out of one's own self-interest as opposed to simply doing whatever one wants or considering short-term desires only. The good under this theory is one's own rational self-interest, and the primary arguments or justifications given in favor of ethical egoism and their counter-arguments are: first, that altruism is self-defeating. The first counter-argument to this was that we do sometimes know what people want and can give them what they prefer. And the second counter-argument to this is that acting like an ethical egoist because it is better for others isn't really ethical egoism at all. The second argument in favor of ethical egoism is that it is the only theory that takes the individual seriously. The counter to this was that this assumes that one must be entirely altruistic or entirely egoistic. The third argument in favor of ethical egoism is that ethical egoism explains and endorses common sense morality. The counter to this was that ethical egoism does not provide moral motivation when one can't or won't get caught for violating a common sense moral rule. The method of ethical egoism is to determine what is really in one's own interest and follow that course of action. The justification for this is that this is directly doing or achieving the goal. The primary arguments given against ethical egoism are: first, ethical egoism endorses wickedness. The counter to this was that this might be begging the question. The second argument against ethical egoism was that ethical egoism is logically inconsistent. The potential counter to this was that this contains a hidden premise inconsistent with ethical egoism. The third argument against ethical egoism, and the one Rachel finds most convincing, is that ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary. And again, Rachel believes this argument to be the strongest argument of the three. Well, that just about wraps up this presentation. Until next time.